let you guys know this is something that we're aware of within the Douglas Basin. It is the compaction of the aquifer formation from dewatering. This is a shot of one of our geophysicists near Eloy. This is from 1952 to 2018. There's been 16 feet of land subsidence. So that's a non-trivial amount. That's a lot. That's enough to damage your property and make life harder for people. Wilcox here, this is from 69 to 2018, and that's 9.7 feet. So that's about 10 feet. Here are some wellheads. One is in Wilcox, the other one's in Apache Junction. But when these wells were installed, that cement pad was at land surface. And in the couple decades since, the entire area, not just right where the well is, the entire area has gone down. But the well casing will not collapse or crush like a soda can, so it stays up, and the cement pad is still high. So one other dangerous part about land subsidence is earth fissuring. And earth fissures are a surface expression of when there is land subsidence. So going back to this basin diagram, we're going to zoom in on just the edge to show you how earth fissures develop. So same thing, alluvial sediments, here's your water table. As we pump, the water level goes down. The formation starts to compact and go down, but the problem is this area can't go down any further because there's bedrock. It's shallower bedrock, and wherever you have a bedrock high, like an elbow or any kind of local bedrock underneath, it won't compress, but the stuff around it will. And what you end up have happening is this side will keep going down, but this side will not. And you get fractures that propagate. They're not really geologic fractures because they're not bedrock. They're earth fissures because they're within the sediment or the alluvium. And the thing about earth fissures is that they can open up overnight. So they don't happen slow, they happen fast. Because it will hold and hold and hold until it breaks, and then it happens quick. So here's one near Hermosillo that was, I want to say that this one was about 25 feet deep, and about, at the widest sections, it's like 30 plus feet wide. But this showed up overnight. Here's another one. This one is actually west of Phoenix, but this was a road that this person had driven on just the day before. And here they come back out to the same spot, and they didn't even realize there was an earth fissure there. This one's in the Harquahala Valley, that's west of Phoenix, and it's a little bit older, and you can tell that because this looks like a little eroded. It's been exposed for a bit, but this one is really deep, things like 35 feet. So they're hazard to people as well, not just your property. So one of the last sources of data that we have is the INA reported pumping data. When you first look at this plot, this is actually a total discharge or total reported pumping for each of these years. And it looks pretty flat all the way across. But if you look, and these are only the wells that report their data to us or have reported their data to us. If you look from 1984 to 2007, you can see that the average withdrawal is 41,000 acre feet, roughly. And then if you look at the next set of years, the average goes up to 56.9 acre feet per year. So there's been an increase over the last few decades, the last few years as well. This is one way to look at it, and another way to look at this type of data is to take a statistical average across the whole interval. So from beginning to end, what does that statistical trend look like? And this is an increase of 810 acre feet of additional withdrawal year over year. Meaning every year it's an additional 610 acre feet. 610 acre feet is a lot of water. It's about almost 200 million gallons. So data needs, for an AMA, we have to develop a groundwater flow model. For us to develop one, we need as much data as we can to make it as accurate as possible. So we need any additional water level data. If you guys have any, feel free to send it to us. We also need any pump testing data. If you've pump tested, you installed a new pump and the pump operator did a step test for you or did some kind of well efficiency testing for you. That data can help us because we can back calculate the aquifer characteristics. So we can take the pump test data and actually figure out what the hydraulic conductivity is of the aquifer unit. And we need to know those values for developing a model. We also need any lithologic data. So this is like the cuttings, the drill cuttings. So, you know, when you're drilling a new well, or if you drill old wells, if you collect chip trays, they're super helpful. If you had someone log the well for you, like a geo or the driller themselves even, any of those data are great. They let us know where the coarse grain sections are, where the fine grain sections are, so that we can make our model match. And then also any downhole geophysical logs. So sometimes when people drill and install wells, they'll do wireline geophysics and they collect a lot of good data. Most people refer to them as e-logs, but there's a lot more than electronic logs. There's the gamma and caliper and so on. But if you have any e-log data for any of your wells, it would be appreciated too. So to summarize the hydro part, this is the technical portion. The inflow into the Douglas Basin from recharge and from perennial streams, USGS estimates it to be 22,000 acre-feet per year of water coming into the system. All of the withdrawal and pumping and everything else that we have within the basin is on average about 45,000 acre-feet per year, as estimated by the USGS. This means that the system itself is going to be declining and losing water over time. It's not recharging. So when we say that, look at all these wells, the water level over time will always be decreasing, then the ones that we have measurements for, it's because for the overall basin-wide system, there's an imbalance, right? There's more being withdrawn than is recharging. Some groundwater declines of over 200 feet have been observed in this basin. And land subsidence and earth fissures are already here in this basin that have been exposed and measured. So these are real concerns. And that does it for my part.
All right. Thank you, Ryan. All right. So I know that was a lot of information. I'm going to be throwing a bunch more information at you. Like we said, this presentation will be available on our website. Both the recording and the slides will be available on our website. You'll also notice that we have a lot of the links available both in the slides and on the back of the agendas that were at the front table. There's a number of links and references and contacts and that type of thing. So you all can come back to this and review it and also ask questions. So, we do still have a fair amount of content to work through. I'm going to do my best to try to get through it quickly to allow enough time for questions and comments. But like I said at the beginning, we do want to do our best to provide some baseline vocabulary and some of these baseline concepts that we're really going to need to talk through in order to establish some of the structures here. There we go, good. So the statutory structure, the statutory framework for most of what we're going to cover today comes from the 1980 Groundwater Management Act. This act provides regulations for groundwater in certain parts of the state. It also authorizes additional areas to be regulated by determination of ADWR's director, or, like what happened here, by local initiation and election. The Groundwater Management Act created the Arizona Department of Water Resources, which is where we all are from. ADWR is responsible for administering the requirements established in this law under the Groundwater Management Act, including permitting and reporting requirements and implementing the conservation requirements for water users in AMAs. The structure that the Groundwater Management Act laid out is additive. So you can see here that the kind of first level of that is statewide requirements. This is what applies in all of the areas around the state that are not an AMA or an INA. So statewide, folks are required to register wells. There are adequate water supply requirements, which I'll talk about a little bit later, and community water systems are required to submit system water plans and annual reports. There is additional regulation in an INA. Again, it's additive, so the statewide requirements apply, and then the INA requirements apply. So in an INA, an irrigation non-expansion area, the expansion of irrigated acres is prohibited, so it's just what it sounds like. In addition, as many of you know, there is metering and reporting required for many users in an INA. An AMA, again, is additive, so there's additional requirements on top of what is required in an INA. So an AMA, an active management area, has assured water supply requirements, which I'll get into a little bit later. We also have management goals, management plans, and conservation programs. And I'll talk through what all of that means in a little bit again. There are also grandfathered rights and withdrawal permits required, as well as spacing requirements and other provisions that apply. We now have 6 AMAs and 3 INAs in the state of Arizona. And this is actually the first time I've shown this updated slide because the breakdown of those areas has changed in the last month. So our 6 AMAs are initially our 5 AMAs were Prescott, Phoenix, Pinal, Tucson, and Santa Cruz. Santa Cruz was created in the mid-90s, but it was a part of the original Tucson AMA footprint. So prior to the Douglas AMA being established last month, these 5 AMAs, that footprint hadn't changed since 1980. So this is the first time a new AMA that wasn't originally AMA land has been created. There are also 3 INAs. We have the Joseph City and the Harquahala INA that, again, have been around since the 80s. Harquahala was created just after the 1980 Groundwater Management Act. And then the Hualapai Valley INA in northwestern Arizona was created last month as well. So last month was a significant month in terms of this particular map. So like I said, the Douglas AMA is the first ever subsequent AMA in Arizona, and also the first ever regulated area to be established by local election. I know this is a little bit hard to see, but there is a dotted line on the map here, which shows the boundary of the former INA that's located inside the basin. So what I want to point out as important here is that the AMA boundary is slightly larger than the INA boundary was. So there is a small portion of land kind of around the outside of the INA that is within the AMA that was not a part of the INA. And that's going to be important coming up here in a little bit, but also is important in terms of folks' general familiarity with the regulations. If you weren't previously in the INA, you might not be as familiar with those types of regulations. So it's important to note that there is that kind of new area around the edge of the basin that is included here.
When was that added in?
That's included as a part of the statutory structure around creating a new AMA. New AMAs are created based.
New boundary. When did you move the boundary?
It's created based on basin boundaries, where that was a part of the election this past November. So it was established in December.
Should not have been allowed to vote on this yes or no on this AMA because they were outside the district when you drew the lines and you redrew the lines, and it's wrong.
I understand that you're upset, sir, and we're not here to debate whether the AMA should or shouldn't have been created. What we're doing now is looking into the types of things that we need to do in order to establish the AMA. So, the AMA is located entirely in Cochise County. Cochise County has an ordinance that we refer to as mandatory adequacy, and that'll play into how what this means for assured water supply that I'll talk through in a little bit later in the presentation. So, an active management area. We have a few definitions that I'm going to work through before we get too far into this. One that's really important is the definition of irrigation. Irrigation for our purposes, and the way I'm going to use irrigation today, is not watering your backyard garden. We're talking about very specifically applying water to 2 or more acres of land to produce plants or parts of plants for sale or consumption. So that would include watering a 2 acre or more pasture for grazing, because that would be then consumed by whatever animals are grazing there. It would include farming activities and that type of thing. But it's important to understand that 2 acre threshold. When we talk about irrigation authorities, when we talk about the prohibition of irrigation, of additional acres being irrigated, we're talking specifically about that definition. You cannot begin irrigating 2 or more acres of land. So those lands that are using groundwater, whether for irrigation uses or for non-irrigation uses, are required to have a grandfathered right. And I'm going to talk through the different types of grandfathered rights and some of the details there on a later slide. But basically the grandfathered right basically just acknowledges that there was a right or there was a water use prior to the establishment of the AMA, and that is going to be grandfathered into the AMA. So I'll talk specifically about the different types of grandfathered rights and the types of things that are being grandfathered in. An exempt well is not subject to metering and reporting requirements in an AMA. So there's 3 things that you have to meet in order to be classified as an exempt well. It has to be 35 gallons or less. It has to be used for non-irrigation purposes, so you can't use an exempt well to irrigate more than 2 acres of land. Even if it's a 30 GPM well, if you're irrigating more than 2 acres, we'll classify that as a non-exempt well. So 35 gallons or less, used for non-irrigation purposes, and cannot exceed 10 acre feet or more for non-irrigation purposes. So if you're using it for irrigation, or if you're using more than 10 acre feet for a non-irrigation purpose, then you'll need a grandfathered right, and we will classify that well as a non-exempt well. I'm not going to get into the GUAC too much today. There is a council that is associated with each AMA. It's a Groundwater Users Advisory Council. These members are governor appointed, and there is a website on the boards and commissions, Arizona Boards and Commissions website, where folks can apply to be a member of that council. Finally, acre-foot. You've heard this term already a few times. Ryan, I don't remember if you actually defined this or not. Acre-feet is our kind of standard unit of measurement for water. Many of you already know what this is, but if you're not familiar with this term, it's equivalent to 325,851 gallons, or the amount of water that it would take to fill 1 acre of land 1 foot deep. All right, so kind of an update on the sequence of events that led us here. The call for the election occurred on August 30th, 2022. On that date, that call for the election established a prohibition on the irrigation of any acres not legally irrigated at any time during the prior 5 years.
No notice was given to people prior to that. Within 5 acres there.
And what happened to our grandfather water rights?
Well, we're gonna come back to that. I have more information and we'll get to that, and I promise that we'll have time to get to all of your questions. So only acres of land that were legally irrigated at any time in the prior 5 years preceding the call for the election may be irrigated. That is your legal cutoff date. So the limitation on those acres continued until the certification of the election. So Wilcox was also on the ballot. The Wilcox vote did not pass. So on December 1st, when the votes were certified, the prohibition was lifted in Wilcox. But on December 1st, when the Douglas AMA was established and those votes were certified, the prohibition was set to remain in effect permanently. So what you'll see is some major characteristics of an AMA. I'm going to walk through these, and you'll notice on this slide that I have initial noted on here. So what I'm referring to is these are major characteristics that you might have already heard about in the existing AMAs and the previous AMAs. And I'm going to point out a couple differences between what you might see in the other AMAs and what we'll see in Douglas. There are some slight differences in the statutory provisions here. So I just want to point that out, that you'll notice some of these slides will say initial and some of them might say subsequent. The list here is not comprehensive, but we did want to kind of work through some of the major items. Like I said, there's a prohibition on the expansion of irrigated acres. There are metering and reporting requirements. All water users who withdraw water from a non-exempt well have to meter from that non-exempt well and have to submit annual reports. There is a management goal, which we'll be talking about later. Management plans, which we'll be developing over the course of the next couple years. There are also wells requirements related to well spacing and well impact analyses. There are groundwater rights and withdrawal authorities. Like I said, I'll touch on the different types of those. And there is assured water supply as opposed to adequate water supply. In a subsequent AMA, so in the Douglas AMA, many of these things apply. There's a prohibition on the expansion of irrigated acres. Metering and reporting requirements exist. So if you do not already have a meter on your well, you will be required to install an approved meter on your well, and you will be required to submit annual reports to ADWR by March 31st of each year, starting next year. There is a management goal, and you'll see an ARS, Arizona Revised Statutes, reference here. What that points out is that as opposed to the initial AMAs, where all of the goals were established in statute, we'll be having a process here, starting today, to discuss and establish a management goal for the Douglas AMA. Similarly, the management plan will have to go through a process to develop what will be contained in that management plan. I can't yet tell you what those conservation requirements will be, what that management plan will look like, because we haven't gone through the process to develop it yet. There are wells requirements, particularly impact analysis required for new non-exempt wells. And like I said, there are groundwater rights and withdrawal authorities. The one thing that I kind of skipped over here, withdrawal fees. This is an important one. The other AMAs have withdrawal fees that are established by statute. Those statutes are specific to those initial AMAs, those specific AMAs. And withdrawal fees are not authorized in the Douglas AMA. So at this time, there will be no withdrawal fees in the Douglas AMA. All right, I've already touched on this a little bit, but I'll kind of reiterate a lot of this because it's important and we want to make sure you all understand. Excuse me. So, who is allowed to use groundwater? Generally, if you have an exempt well, generally a person can withdraw groundwater for a non-irrigation use from an exempt well, so a well that has less, 35 gallons per minute or less pump capacity, without a groundwater right or permit. So if you have an individual well that you're just using for your house, a domestic well, its pump capacity is less than 35 GPM, you likely don't need to apply for a permit, a withdrawal authority or permit. There are, like I said earlier, there are some limitations on the uses of exempt wells though. So you can use only one exempt well at the same location, and withdrawals from that exempt well have to be for a non-irrigation purpose, so domestic use, stock watering, that type of thing, and less than 10 acre-feet per year, limited to 10 acre-feet per year. For non-exempt wells, in order to withdraw water from a non-exempt well, you do need a groundwater authority or permit. So a person may withdraw groundwater from a well and from a non-exempt well only if the person holds a right or a permit to withdraw the groundwater. So any person irrigating 2 or more acres or using 10 or more acre feet for a non-irrigation use. So those are 2 different types of permits. An irrigation permit for 2 or more acres or 10 or more acre feet for a non-irrigation use must file an application for a grandfathered right to obtain that withdrawal authority. I'm going to emphasize this a few times here, but this is the first time it comes up. There is an application requirement for those withdrawal authorities, for those grandfathered rights. There is a 15-month deadline in statute, and ADWR does not have flexibility on that 15-month deadline. There is a specific provision in the law that says if you do not apply within that 15-month time period, that you will be deemed to have waived and relinquished your right to use groundwater on that land. So I want to be really clear about that because we do not have flexibility on that item. So I want to make sure people are aware of that provision.
Are you gonna speak about how much it's gonna cost?
I'll get there, yes.
Even to apply and not guaranteed?
So, I have a slide in a little bit about the fees, yes. So there are well spacing requirements for non-exempt wells. So an application for a permit to drill a new non-exempt well, it has to be deemed to not cause unreasonable harm to surrounding wells. So there is what we call a well impact analysis conducted for new non-exempt wells. So that process for non-exempt wells, for new drill cards for non-exempt wells, does have an extra step to it in an active management area. Measuring and reporting, like I said, with a few narrow exceptions, persons withdrawing water from non-exempt wells are required to meter and report their water use from that well with an approved measuring device. The approved measuring devices are listed out both in rule and on our website. We can provide links for that. Folks using exempt wells, and like I talked about, those 3 different requirements for exempt wells. Folks using exempt wells generally are not required to meter or report their use. So, coming back again to Douglas AMA. In a subsequent AMA, so Douglas AMA, which was established on December 1st, 2022, only those lands that were irrigated 5 years prior to the call for election can continue to be irrigated, with a couple exceptions. Acres of land that were not irrigated during that 5-year period may be irrigated with decreed or appropriative surface water, if that surface water right was established prior to the date for the call of the election. And acres of land that were not irrigated during the relevant 5-year time period may be irrigated if they can demonstrate substantial capital investment within a particular window of time. And I'm going to come back to that because there's a little bit of nuance related to that window of time because some lands were in INA and some lands were not in INA. So I'm going to come back to that and clarify that. What I want to emphasize here is that the historical reference period that we use for this AMA for that historical irrigation period is August 30th, 2017 through August 30th, 2022. So that's the time period for any acres that were irrigated in any time during that time period are able to be continued to be irrigated going forward. Substantial capital investment. This one is complicated. So this is something that is going to be a case-by-case analysis. I am not going to be able to answer your case-specific questions about what you've done on your property and whether that'll qualify for substantial capital investment. We just can't because it is case-by-case and because there are so many different considerations that we'll take into account. We just cannot provide specific interpretations for specific circumstances at this time. folks who believe that they could qualify for consideration for substantial capital investment should submit attachment A with their application for grandfathered right. And we'll evaluate those on a case-by-case basis. So coming back to kind of the language here, what I want to point out is that we have two bullet points here. So for lands that were previously in the INA, there is one set of requirements, and that's that bottom section. For lands that were not previously in an INA, that's the top section. So the time period for substantial capital investment for lands that were not previously in an INA, so that kind of strip around the edge of the basin, the time period for substantial capital investment is 5 years. And you can see kind of the description in this definition of what would be considered for substantial capital investment. For area that was previously an INA, the time period for substantial capital investment is 12 months. And in this, and you can also see a description of what would be considered to be substantial capital investment for lands that were previously in an INA. Those descriptions are very slightly different. And again, we can't necessarily say if one thing or another thing will be kind of considered under those different definitions. If you're concerned or if you have questions about your specific circumstances, we would really encourage you to seek legal advice.
Just to be clear, it's gonna cost $500 just to apply.
Right. I have a slide for that.
$1,000 up to $10,000.
I have a slide for that, and I'll clarify. So we have 3 major types of grandfathered rights, and I know this is a little bit hard to see, but again, we really wanted to emphasize that deadline because that's important. So your major types of grandfathered rights are irrigation rights, and then we have 2 different types of non-irrigation rights. So an irrigation grandfathered right, or what we refer to as an IGFR or sometimes an IGR, is going to be your right that allows you to irrigate, to apply water to 2 or more acres of land. So this is going to be based on that historic irrigation or on substantial capital investment. And this grandfathered right is tied to that physical land. So if you sell that piece of land, that right goes with that land. A type 1 non-irrigation grandfathered right is created from the permanent retirement of irrigated lands. And this water is used for non-irrigation purposes. Typically, a type 1 is gonna be 3 acre-feet per acre or less. And in a lot of cases, that is tied to the land, although there's exceptions there. Type 1s can be confusing. Type 2s are kind of our most flexible type of non-irrigation right. So a type 2 is established based on non-irrigation use that was occurring prior to the establishment of the AMA, in the 5 years prior to the designation of the AMA. So an example of this might be a hospital or an airport or a school that is using more than 10 acre-feet of water per year, that was a non-irrigation use that was established, that was occurring in the 5 years prior to the AMA. So they would be examples of something that might apply for a type 2. And again, emphasizing that deadline, March 1st, 2024. Let me just make sure I'm not missing anything here. Good. It is important to note that none of these grandfathered rights are issued automatically. And like I said earlier, a person claiming the right to use groundwater must file an application for that right within 15 months after the designation of the AMA, which was December 1st, 2022. So that deadline is March 1st, 2024. We have today and previously received a lot of questions about the fees for these applications. So I do want to provide some additional detail on what those fees are today. The initial fees associated with each application function as a deposit on an hourly fee. So ADWR staff time spent processing a given application is then billed against that deposit, and if the final total exceeds the deposit, we'll issue a bill. If the final total is less than the deposit, then we'll issue a refund. So each application form, or each grandfathered right type has an application form. So we have 3 application forms that you can fill out. So one for an IGFR, an irrigation grandfathered right, one for a type 1, and one for a type 2. We also have attachment A, which is that substantial capital investment attachment, which can be included on any of those other 3 application types. So the substantial capital investment should always be submitted with another application. For a simple IGFR, so if you have been irrigating in the last 5 years and you have an irrigation authority in the INA and you're not claiming any substantial capital investment, that's what we are kind of referring to as a simple IGFR application. The initial fee for a simple IGFR application is $500.
What?
For a more complex IGFR, for anything that's outside the former INA, anything that is claiming substantial capital investment, that initial fee is $1,000. For type 1s, I'll come to that. So for type 1s and type 2s, so our non-irrigation grandfathered rights, the initial fee is $1,000. For the attachment, for attachment A, where you can claim substantial capital investment, that's just included with one of these other applications. That's not an additional fee for the application, you just include it as a part of one of these other applications. But substantial capital investment always, because it's such a fact-intensive type of consideration, that is always going to be, on the IGFR side, on the irrigation side, it's always going to be a complex application. So any application that includes consideration of substantial capital investment, that initial fee is going to be $1,000. So we have those fees. The initial fee, we talked about $500 or $1,000 depending on the type of application. The initial fee is a deposit on that hourly rate, so you may receive a refund or a bill. The maximum bill is $10,000.
And you only get the people that voted it in, you had to say,
Unfortunately, at this time, ADWR does not have flexibility on these fees.
Well, a while ago, you said that basically substantial, if you put money into your farm, we're gonna give you your water rights. If you're poor, they ain't gonna give you nothing. You guys are gonna get sued and you deserve every bit of it.
Unfortunately, at this time, ADWR does not have flexibility on these fees.
Can you just put me on a reservation and give me a check?
And these rules, or excuse me, the fees are set in rule. We understand that the fees are high, but at this time, ADWR does not have flexibility on these fees.
Let's move on.
We'll go ahead and move on.
we're here to learn.
So again, I really want to make sure that you all hear this, which is really critical information. These are areas that I want to be clear. There are laws, there are statutory requirements where we do not have flexibility. We as an agency do not have the authority to go against what the laws say. We don't have.
State voters can implement this?
So based on the establishment of the AMA by local election on December 1st, 2022, the grandfathered right applications are due on March 1st, 2024, and failure to apply by that deadline will result in the waiver and relinquishment of any right to use groundwater on that land. So tell your friends and neighbors, please make sure that this word gets out. We're going to do our best to publicize this, but this is a really important deadline. All right. In addition to those grandfathered rights, there are a couple other different types of groundwater withdrawal authorities that folks can apply for in an active management area. These allow the permit holder to withdraw groundwater for a non-irrigation use for certain prescribed uses and typically for a certain prescribed amount of time. Examples of this are hydrologic testing permits, poor quality groundwater permits, temporary electrical generation permits for emergencies, drainage or dewatering, general industrial use permits, and things like mineral extraction permits. There are also service area rights in an AMA. So a service area right is a withdrawal authority for a water provider to provide water to customers in their service area. This right changes, it provides that water provider authority to provide water to customers within their service area. So that service area expands and the right thus expands. Those service areas, those municipal water providers, are typically subject to conservation requirements under the management plans, which again we'll be developing over the next couple of years. All right, we're going to come back to management goals at the end, but this is an important part of active management areas. So for the 5 initial AMAs, the management goals were established in statute. For 4 out of our 5 AMAs, they have what we refer to as a safe yield goal, basically a long-term balance between the amount of groundwater, the amount of water going into the aquifer as compared to the amount going out. Pinal AMA has a different goal, which allows the development of non-irrigation uses and also attempts to preserve existing agricultural economies in the active management area. So we have these prior goals. Douglas is really unique as compared to these previous AMAs though, because these goals were established as a part of the law in 1980. And in Douglas, we are going to be establishing the management goal in a different method. And part of that is why we're having this meeting today, to start having conversations about that management goal. So we'll come back to that at the end. We do have some kind of principles and that kind of thing associated with the goal, but it's important to note that this is really like a guiding principle for how we manage the AMA as a whole. Management plans are also established in statute. So you'll notice here that this says initial AMAs. The management plan statutes for subsequent AMAs are slightly different, but very generally, the management plans are designed to be a series of plans working toward the management goal of a given active management area by reducing withdrawals of groundwater. So the management plans contain conservation programs for your major water use sectors. In the initial AMAs, we have focused on agriculture, municipal, industrial, with various types of conservation programs for water users in those sectors. Again, these are conservation programs developed in the management plans. These are regulatory requirements for those users, but we haven't yet developed those for this AMA, and we'll be developing that over the course of the next couple of years through discussions like this. So the function here, just to kind of reiterate that, is that the conservation programs are supposed to be designed to reduce withdrawals of groundwater. And the purpose of that, we're conserving water in order to move the AMA toward its management goal. So the management plans contain the conservation programs which help move the AMA toward its management goal. All right. Burning through it. I know this is a lot of content, and I know this is really dense. Again, this is going to be online. We're going to be, we are recording this meeting, and we'll be posting both the recording and the presentation online. The last component of an AMA that I'm going to cover before we get back to that management goal piece is assured water supply. So areas outside the AMAs are subject to an adequate water supply requirement. So outside the AMAs, a developer of a proposed subdivision must obtain from ADWR a report on the adequacy of water supply for 100 years. Cochise County is referred to, has what is referred to as mandatory adequacy. So there was an existing requirement here that that water report indicate that there is an adequate water supply in order for a given plat to be approved. Excuse me. As an AMA now, Douglas is subject to assured water supply, which kind of similar to the tiered requirements for statewide IMA, AMA, this is a second tier additional requirements in addition to those adequacy requirements. So you are required to, in order to obtain a permit for a new subdivision, a developer would need to demonstrate physical, legal, and continuous availability, financial capability, and that the water is of adequate quality. In addition, once these things are established, that developer would also need to demonstrate as a part of that determination consistency with the management goal of the AMA, which again, we have yet to establish, and consistency with the management plan of the AMA. All right, so the actual topic here, management goal. So I know this is an enormous amount of background. I know we're throwing a lot at you. But the management goal is really a big part of the reason that we wanted to hold this meeting today. ADWR sees public input on the development of the management goal as something that is critically important for the Douglas AMA. And is going to be really important to us successfully establishing all the processes associated with the AMA. So what I'm going to do now is provide a little bit of a framework for a management goal, some ideas that we've heard already, and a little bit of guidance on how we can best work together, how we can best have constructive input onto the development of the goal. So, we talked about these existing goals for the other AMAs that were established in statute. So, theoretically, a goal for the Douglas AMA could be the same as one of these, or it could be something totally different, totally brand new. We're not constrained by these existing goals. What we're doing today is starting a process by which the goal will be proposed. We've received a few suggestions already. We appreciate the engagement and the proactiveness of the folks who've already sent us comments. We've gotten some really thoughtful comments already, and we really appreciate that. But we do want to provide additional opportunity for folks to weigh in. We will weigh the comments we've received previously as a part of all of this, but we also want to weigh what we've heard today and provide a little bit of an opportunity for folks to submit comments after today once you've had a little bit of time to digest some of this. So we set a deadline of January 20th, which is about 2 weeks from now, for submitting those comments. And you can submit those comments by email to managementplans@azwater.gov, and that email address is on the back of those agendas that were at the front table. Once we have established a draft management goal, ADWR will hold a formal public hearing on that draft goal. And a part of that formal public hearing is another public comment period. So what I really want to emphasize there is that there are multiple points that we're building into this process for public feedback, and we really do want to hear from all of you related to the management goal.
Will there be an actual board on this to set this up?
There will be a GUAC, a Groundwater Users Advisory
How will
Council.
they be elected, or will they be appointed?
Those are appointed by the governor.
And will they be from this district, or will they be from outside this district?
Typically it's folks, I don't believe it's mandatory that they are folks in the basin, but typically it's folks in the basin or who have specific expertise about issues related to the basin. We can come back to that. All right, so management plans will also be developed and adopted, we will certainly be providing multiple points of contact for public input throughout the development of the management plans as well. We don't have quite as much information on the management plans process at this point because the development of the management plans will really be informed by the management goal. So we want to set the management goal first, and then we'll begin the process of developing the management plan.
So don't you need a board before you set the management program?
There is a statutory requirement that the GUAC comment and provide input on the management plan, but we have some time for that. So we'll come back to that. For the management goals specifically, we wanted to provide a little bit of a framework for you all. We know when we talk about just a management goal as this big kind of amorphous thing, it can be a little bit difficult to imagine what might make a management goal. So we wanted to provide a little bit of a template, a little bit of a framework here to help generate some ideas and to help you all provide constructive input. So the framework you can see here, the kind of general template is that we want to establish, so the management goal of the Douglas AMA is to establish some goal by meeting some criteria, some measurable objective by a certain timeline. Some of those things are statutory requirements for goals. We have to have a timeline in the goal. And really what we've seen is that a lot of the other goals follow this type of similar format, and this seems to be a really functional thing for goals. This is certainly not mandatory, but we thought this might be something that's helpful as we consider how to establish this goal. We also developed or identified a number of principles that we see as important to a management goal. Things that are either required by statute, again, or things that we just identified as really critical to a good functional management goal. So a good management goal should move the AMA towards some kind of long-term sustainability, some criteria regarding water resource management, groundwater management, some criteria related to decreasing the outflows and increasing the inflows of a given basin. A good management goal should be measurable. We should be able to actually look at whether we are succeeding in making progress toward that goal or not. And by statute, it must contain a timeline in which we are targeting to achieve the goal. It must be achievable and appropriate to the Douglas AMA. This is a Douglas AMA specific goal, so obviously we want to customize it for this area. And really, ultimately, it just has to be defensible. We have to make sure that we're not proposing something totally outlandish, so it has to be legal, reasonable, defensible. We have heard some initial ideas, and I know there's a lot here. There is a summary slide of this, and it's actually copied on the back of those agendas again. We've heard a couple ideas for that kind of goal and objective portion, things like extending the life of the aquifer by reducing overdraft through the reductions of withdrawals of groundwater by each water use sector. Another option we've heard is to manage groundwater supplies in a way that slows the decline of groundwater levels in the AMA. Another option might be preserve a sustainable supply of groundwater for non-irrigation uses in the AMA by slowing the decline of groundwater levels. Examples of timelines might be by 2050, within 30 years of the first conservation requirements, or stabilize things within 10 years and achieve reductions thereafter. These are just initial ideas that we heard. We wanted to assemble some of these initial comments that we've either heard externally or folks within our agency had. We are certainly not limited to this, but we wanted to provide a little bit of examples and framework here in order to help facilitate some of this discussion. So this is really where we wanted to focus for this meeting. This is something that obviously is going to be really important for the AMA as a whole. And we hope that having a little bit of a framework and having some of these initial ideas out there are something that can be helpful as you all are thinking about what might make a good goal for the Douglas AMA. So, like I said, we do have this summary slide. I'm gonna have this up on the screen as we're taking questions and comments, just so it's available, so it's visible. But that is finally the end of the presentation. So, what we're gonna do is we're gonna open the floor for questions and comments. Specifically, we're hoping for questions and comments related to the establishment of the AMA and the management goals. Really, the whole point of this meeting was to start receiving initial feedback on that management goal portion specifically. Give me one moment. Like I said earlier, specific questions about individual circumstances. Which application should I file? How do I file my application? Those should be addressed individually. We have on the back of that agenda, there's contact information for our AMA customer service staff, and they are wonderful, and they will help you find the things that you need. Yes, so any of those individual questions should be addressed separately via phone or email. We do ask that, we know this is a difficult topic, we know that this can be a controversial topic. We do ask that you be kind of respectful to both staff and to your fellow participants. I appreciate you all being respectful so far. Lastly, we do ask that you will speak into a microphone. We do have folks participating virtually during today's meeting. So we have microphones kind of at the end of each aisle here. In order that the webinar participants can hear you, we really need you to speak into a microphone so that they can hear what the questions are in order to know what it is we're talking about here. So with that, thank you so much for your attention. We understand this is dense. If you guys want to just kind of start forming lines by the microphone, maybe just like 2 or 3 people in line at a time, but we'll start kind of just going back